The fall of France in June of 1940 represented for Germany a victory so swift that it surprised even its own high command. In 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht had achieved what the German Empire did not accomplish in 4 years during the First World War. The French army, considered until then one of the most powerful military forces on the continent, disintegrated under the advance of the panzer divisions, while British troops evacuated from Dunkirk. By the end of that summer, the Reich controlled France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Denmark, and Norway. The political and military map of Western Europe had been redefined in an exceptionally short time. The territorial magnitude of those conquests posed an immediate challenge. Each new kilometre of coast added an additional stretch to defend. From the Norwegian beaches to the Spanish border, the Germany of 1940 became responsible for approximately 4,000 kilometres of Atlantic coastline. Military logic suggested that this extensive coastal line would end up becoming a possible scenario for an Allied counterattack, although at that moment the threat seemed distant and theoretical. Hitler hoped that the United Kingdom would seek a negotiated peace. Newly in power, Churchill had made it clear that he did not contemplate any surrender, but the Führer believed that the military situation would sooner or later force a diplomatic solution favourable to the Reich. Operation Sea Lion, the German plan for an invasion of the British Isles, progressed little beyond planning. It required air superiority, which the Luftwaffe attempted to achieve during the summer and autumn of 1940 without success. The defeat in the Battle of Britain nullified any immediate possibility of a channel crossing. By December of that year, the idea had been shelved. The United Kingdom remained at war, and the security of the occupied coasts depended more on Allied disinterest than on structured defensive planning. Meanwhile, Germany was preparing its next great strategic gamble. During the autumn and winter of 1940, the focus of the High Command shifted eastward, where the future invasion of the Soviet Union was being planned. The Atlantic coastal strip remained without a defined defensive structure. Only inherited French fortifications and improvised positions by the occupiers existed, garrisoned by second-line units. There was no urgency. The dominant expectation was that the United Kingdom lacked the capability to carry out a significant landing, and that the offensive in the east would resolve the European conflict before the Atlantic coast became a real problem. Operation Barbarossa, launched on the 22nd of June of 1941, absorbed most of the human and material resources of the Reich. The divisions that had conquered France were sent to the vast Soviet steppes. The western coast was left in the hands of occupation units, with limited equipment and primarily administrative functions. The threat of an Allied invasion still seemed remote, while the Wehrmacht advanced towards Leningrad, Moscow, and Kiev. That calculation changed in December of 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th day and the subsequent entry of the United States into the war transformed the strategic situation. Germany declared war on Washington on the 11th of December, linking its fate to that of Japan. The United States had an industrial capacity that far exceeded all European powers. Its entry into the conflict turned the possibility of an Allied invasion in Western Europe into a strategic certainty. It was no longer just about containing an insular power with limited resources. Now it faced an adversary capable of producing fleets, planes, and war material in unprecedented quantities. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the German offensive had lost momentum. The advance towards Moscow was halted by the autumn mud and then by the winter. In December of 1941, the Soviet counter-offensive forced the Germans to retreat for the first time since the start of the campaign. Germany found itself trapped in a war of attrition in the east without having resolved the situation in the west. The scenario that had been attempted to avoid since 1939, a war on two fronts, had fully materialized. In that context, Allied raids on the western coast acquired a new significance. Although limited in scale, they demonstrated that the occupied coast was not beyond the reach of offensive operations. On the 27th of December of 1941, British commandos attacked the Norwegian islands of Vågsøy and Måløy, destroying port facilities and withdrawing after several hours of combat. The operation revealed deficiencies in German surveillance and confirmed that the coastline was vulnerable. In March of 1942, another blow increased the concern of the German High Command. Operation Chariot, directed against the French port of Saint-Nazaire, managed to disable the only dock capable of housing the battleship Tirpitz. The attack, carried out using a destroyer loaded with explosives and supported by commandos, had a considerable operational impact. For Hitler, it was a clear sign that the British were willing to take high risks to attack strategic targets on the Atlantic coast. These operations directly influenced German strategic thinking. Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt requested reinforcements and an urgent review of coastal defences. Hitler, aware of the growing threat posed by the United States and the stalemate in the East, began to seriously consider the need for a permanent defensive line in Western Europe. The reasoning was clear. Sooner or later, the Allies would try to land on the continent to relieve the pressure on the Soviet Union and open a decisive second front. On March 23, 1942, Hitler issued Führer Directive No. 40. This directive, titled Orders for the Preparation of Coastal Defence, marked the official beginning of the project that would be known as the Atlantic Wall. The document ordered the transformation of the European coast, from Norway to the Spanish border, into a continuous defensive system capable of withstanding an Allied landing. Hitler insisted that the defence could not rely on mobile reserves. It had to be based on permanent fortifications capable of absorbing a naval and air attack without collapsing in the early hours. The directive defined geographical priorities. Regions with strategic ports or areas considered vulnerable due to their topography had to be fortified first. Coastal artillery positions had to be integrated with reinforced concrete bunkers. Beaches susceptible to a landing needed anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and machine gun positions in depth. Each sector had to have defensive autonomy during the initial stages of a potential attack. The responsibility for executing this project fell on the Todt organization, directed since February of 1942 by Albert Speer after the death of Fritz Todt. The scale of the construction effort was considerable. Fortifying 4,000 kilometers of coastline required resources that were already committed on other fronts. Germany had to mobilize large amounts of concrete, steel, and labor, in a context where the industry was working at the limit of its capacity to sustain the war in the East. The first few months following the directive were characterized by a lack of clarity in the chain of command. The Todt organization was responsible for construction, but local military commanders decided the location and function of each fortification. Speer attempted to impose standardization through Regelbau designs developed by the Festungspionier, but geographical diversity and material shortages led to numerous local adaptations. The result was a heterogeneous defensive system, with sectors advancing at very different paces. By the end of 1942, the construction of fortifications had begun along the entire Atlantic coast, but the distribution was uneven. Calais received a significant concentration of resources due to its proximity to England. Ports like Cherbourg and Brest were prioritized for their strategic value. In contrast, wide regions of Normandy and Brittany progressed slowly, with scattered structures and more limited resources. On the 19th of August of 1942, the Allied attack against Dieppe once again altered the German perception. More than 6,000 men participated in an assault that ended in a costly defeat for the attackers. The German defences, even though they were partial and in some cases improvised, managed to repel the operation. Hitler interpreted the result as proof of the effectiveness of the fortifications and concluded that a solid defensive system could stop a landing even if it included numerous and well-equipped forces. Less than 1 week later, he ordered to accelerate the project. He demanded to double the allocated resources and set new quantitative goals. Thousands of permanent fortifications had to be completed by the end of 1943. Each artillery position had to be protected with high-strength concrete bunkers. The possible landing sectors required defences in depth capable of slowing down or stopping any initial advance. The TOT organization expanded its recruitment of labour through French workers, the Vichy compulsory labour service, and the transfer of Soviet prisoners of war and forced labourers from other occupied territories. Tens of thousands of people were assigned to the project. The transport of concrete, steel, and machinery depended on an overloaded railway network in constant competition with the needs of the Eastern Front. By the end of 1942, the construction of the defensive system had acquired a steady pace, although it was still marked by the lack of uniformity between regions. The Atlantic coastline was gradually transforming into a succession of fortified positions that, however, still lacked a coherent employment doctrine. The structures were growing in number, but there was no consensus among the German commanders on how they should be integrated into a unified defensive plan. This lack of clarity would become decisive when new officers with extensive operational experience arrived in France in the following months, facing a rapidly fortifying coast, but still without a common strategic vision on its use. The TOT organization, although not part of the army in the strict sense, operated with a hierarchical structure and procedures typical of an entity directly linked to the war effort. Created in 1933 by Fritz Todt, it had directed essential projects for the Reich, such as the highway network, the expansion of the Siegfried Line, and the construction of airfields. After Todt's death in February of 1942, Albert Speer took over its direction, inheriting an extensive administrative machinery oriented towards large-scale tasks. To execute Führer Directive No. 40, that organization had to multiply its capacity and coordinate hundreds of sites distributed along the Atlantic coast. Its structure combined a strong central command and a wide operational decentralization. Speer set general guidelines, but the Oberbauleiter, regional construction directors, had the authority to recruit workers, requisition resources, and coordinate with local military commanders. This decentralization allowed adaptation to the diverse geography of the coastline, but it also caused significant differences in work rhythms, priorities, and methods. Decisions made in Normandy did not necessarily coincide with those adopted in Brittany or the Netherlands. What was meant to be a homogeneous system became from the start a mosaic of different practices united only by the common goal of fortifying the coast. After the Directive of March of 1942, the first need was to obtain labour on a large scale. The TOT organization did not have enough permanent workers, so it turned to different sources. The first was France, through the Service du Travail Obligatoire, established by Vichy in September of that same year. Thousands of French were mobilized towards the coastal sectors, working long hours with reduced wages. Although they did not face the most severe conditions of the Reich's labor system, their participation occurred in a framework of state coercion. The second source was prisoners of war, primarily Soviets captured in large numbers since 1941. Poles, Yugoslavs, and French captured in 1940 also worked. The Soviets, being the largest group, were used in the harshest tasks and under especially precarious conditions. The lack of adequate shelter, food shortages, and prolonged working hours contributed to a high mortality rate. Incomplete records prevent knowing the exact figure, but the available evidence indicates a significant number of deaths from exhaustion, diseases, and accidents. Forced workers from other occupied territories were also employed. Dutch, Czech, Belgian, and Norwegian people were sent to different sectors, either through compulsory work programs or after arrests linked to resistance activities. There were also Jewish workers, although in smaller proportions than in other Reich projects. This diversity increased administrative complexity and required constant control to maintain productivity. By mid-1943, the construction of the Atlantic Wall required approximately 260,000 workers. Of these, about 100,000 came from the French STO, 80,000 were Soviet prisoners, and about 40,000 were forced labourers from other countries. The rest were technicians, permanent employees of the TOT organization, or volunteers attracted by comparatively high wages. Coordinating this labor force along thousands of kilometers of coastline required an administrative structure that was often overwhelmed by the magnitude of daily operations. Reinforced concrete was the central material of the project. Each bunker, pillbox, or observation post required tons of concrete, whose quality depended on the cement, sand, gravel, and fresh water used. Cement was transported from factories in the Rhineland and northern France to coastal depots in trains competing for space on an overloaded railway network. Priorities on the Eastern Front caused shipments to suffer frequent delays, leaving construction projects incomplete for weeks. Sand and gravel could be sourced locally, but not always in the required quantity or quality, and in some sectors they also had to be transported long distances. Reinforcement steel, indispensable for withstanding stresses and loads, was one of the most contested resources of the Reich. A Type B bunker could require about 8 tons of interwoven steel bars, a Type A up to 15. Speer allocated quotas according to the strategic importance of the sector. Calais, considered the most likely point of an invasion, received large quantities of steel and concrete. Normandy, not being a priority during this period, received less material, which was reflected in the density and solidity of its fortifications. The standardized designs defined by the Festungspioniere, known as Regelbau, were intended to ensure consistency in construction. With hundreds of numbered variants and defined functions, anti-tank casemates, infantry shelters, command posts, or ammunition depots, commanders were expected to select models according to their needs and for the TOT organization to build them following precise specifications. But the practice was far from that approach. Local commanders requested modifications to adjust to the terrain or increase firepower. If steel was lacking, engineers reduced the internal reinforcement. If concrete arrived late, they adjusted the size of the structure. Even in well-supplied sectors, the topography forced changes to the plans to adapt the embrasures or entrances. As a result, although the Regelbau served as a guide, few bunkers fully matched the original models. The construction standards varied according to their resistance. Type A bunkers had walls of 3.5 meters, designed to withstand impacts from heavy naval artillery. The more numerous Type B had walls of 2 meters. Type B1, with reduced thickness, were often partially buried to increase their solidity. Type C and D structures were light and served as basic shelters. This variety sought to balance the availability of resources with the need to cover an extensive coast. One of the most characteristic structures was the Ringstand 58, or Tobruk, a buried concrete position with an upper opening for a machine gun or a small turret. Its low material cost and ease of installation allowed it to be deployed in large numbers, making it a recurring element in sectors where concrete was limited. The construction of a Type B bunker followed relatively uniform phases: excavation, formwork assembly, steel installation, concrete pouring, and curing. Weather conditions influenced each stage. Rain slowed down the pouring, wind affected the uniformity of the layers, and cold prolonged the setting time. Additionally, delays in the supply of cement and steel left structures exposed for days or weeks, which deteriorated the material already poured. Corruption affected multiple levels of the project. In some sectors, the cement and steel were diverted before reaching their destination. Foremen and administrators sold materials on the black market or redirected them to projects unrelated to the wall. Inspections revealed that bunkers declared as completed had thinner walls than stipulated or lacked adequate ventilation. In several cases, salty sand was used, which accelerated the corrosion of the internal steel. The inspection reports carried out between the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943 described recurring problems. In Normandy, about 1/3 of the structures reviewed exhibited deficiencies in wall thickness or in concrete curing. In Brittany, the teams detected similar irregularities. Even sectors such as Calais, priorities for high command, showed early cracks due to rushed pours. Speer attempted to improve control by creating additional inspection teams, but their scope was limited given the vastness of the project. By mid-1943, the Todt organization had constructed about 8,000 structures, far from the 15,000 required by Hitler by the end of that year. Speer attributed the delays to the lack of materials, railway congestion, and competition with other military projects. Hitler ordered work to be accelerated, but an increase in manpower did not solve the shortage of steel and cement. German industrial production was already operating at the limit, and Allied bombings were beginning to affect factories and transportation centers. In various sectors, commanders resorted to temporary solutions to cover defensive gaps. They built smaller bunkers, used less steel than recommended, or erected provisional positions with wood and sandbags. These structures fulfilled basic functions, but they did not meet the standards initially envisaged. By the autumn of 1943, the defensive distribution showed marked differences. Calais accumulated more than 2,000 fortifications. The Channel Islands recorded a high density of bunkers. Ports like Brest, Lorient, and Saint-Nazaire were heavily protected. In contrast, Normandy had fewer than 1,500 structures scattered over wide stretches of coast. This distribution reflected Hitler's belief that an Allied attack would occur by the shortest route from England. By the end of 1943, the Atlantic Wall had consumed more than 17 million cubic meters of concrete and 1.2 million tons of steel, figures comparable to several years of tank production. The financial cost exceeded 3,700 million Reichsmarks. Despite that effort, the result was uneven. Robust sectors coexisted with areas barely defended. The differences in quality, the scarcity of materials, and the absence of a unified doctrine on the use of these fortifications evidenced an underlying problem. The coast was filling up with isolated structures that still did not form an integrated system, and that strategic lack was beginning to become evident even to the German commanders. As 1943 progressed, the question was no longer just how much could be built, but how what had been built should be used against an invasion whose timing was becoming increasingly clear. By the end of 1943, the central question for the German defense in the West was no longer how many bunkers had been built, nor how many resources had been consumed. The problem lay in the absence of a clear doctrine for employing those fortifications when the Allied invasion arrived. For months, construction advanced without any consensus on its operational purpose. The arrival of new commands and the intensification of strategic evaluations transformed that lack of definition into an open conflict within the High Command. In December of 1943, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was assigned to command Army Group B, with direct responsibility for the defense of the coast from Holland to the Loire. His reputation as a commander was well known. In France, in 1940, he had demonstrated the ability to exploit gaps in the enemy's setup. In North Africa, he had led operations for 2 years against an opponent that controlled the air and the sea. He had also suffered there from the growing German dependence on vulnerable supplies and the difficulty of maintaining mobility under constant Allied air surveillance. Those experiences shaped his interpretation of modern combat. Rommel's initial inspections along the Western Front led him to immediate conclusions. He observed that many fortifications were incomplete, that the coastal units lacked mobility, and that the obstacles deployed on various beaches would not be sufficient to prevent a well-coordinated landing. However, what concerned him most was the current defensive strategy. According to the inherited plan, the defense was based on allowing the Allies to land and then launching counterattacks from the interior with armored reserves. For Rommel, that concept was unviable. He argued that any concentration of forces on the roads would be spotted from the air and attacked before reaching the front. In Africa, he had seen how entire columns were destroyed before entering combat. Their proposal was simple in its formulation and strict in its application. The reserves had to be near the coast, not inland. If the enemy was not stopped during the first few hours, it was considered that the front would be compromised. The panzer divisions had to be positioned immediately behind the most likely landing zones, ready to go into action without long deployments. In their view, the battle would be decided before the Allies consolidated a bridgehead. If they succeeded, their material and air superiority would prevent them from being expelled. Rommel's vision clashed with that of Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief in the West since 1942. Rundstedt advocated a strategy based on operational flexibility. For him, placing armoured forces next to the coast was risking their destruction. He considered it inevitable that local garrisons would be overcome during a massive landing, and that the real battle would occur once the Allies advanced inland. In his perspective, the concentration of mobile reserves would allow for identifying the main point of the attack and launching a decisive counterattack when the enemy was still reorganizing. Rundstedt recognized the vulnerability of the roads and the aerial threat, but he trusted the possibility of moving troops during the night or using secondary routes. That confidence was based on previous experiences and on the German doctrine developed over decades, centered on maneuver and operational initiative. From his point of view, dispersing the armored units along the coast turned them into static forces incapable of sustaining a prolonged engagement. This doctrinal clash was not simply a tactical disagreement. It represented two distinct interpretations of how modern combat worked under conditions of enemy air superiority. Rommel, influenced by his recent experience, saw mobility as a disadvantage. Rundstedt, shaped by the campaigns of 1939 and 1940, still believed in the possibility of concentrating and maneuvering. The situation was complicated because neither of the two had full authority to impose their judgment. The final decision rested with Adolf Hitler. His relationship with the High Command was marked by distrust. He considered the generals to be too cautious in their recommendations for withdrawal or maneuver, and he believed that his own intervention had been decisive at critical moments on the Eastern Front. That perception reinforced his tendency to centralize decisions. In the case of the defense of the West, Hitler tried to satisfy both positions, which resulted in a hybrid and dysfunctional system. At the beginning of 1944, he assigned 3 panzer divisions to Rommel, positioning them in areas near the Normandy coast. At the same time, he left 4 divisions under direct control of the OKW, which implied that any movement required his personal authorization. Rundstedt received command of other divisions, although with significant restrictions. The immediate consequence was that no authority had full control of the armored forces. The lack of clarity affected not only the senior officers, but also the troops. The coastal units received contradictory orders. Some had to defend their positions until the end, while others had to withdraw if necessary to preserve forces intended for the counterattack. This mix hindered preparation and created uncertainty among the subordinate commanders, who did not know what the exact role of their units would be during the first moments of a landing. The geographical issue added another layer of complexity. Hitler was convinced that the landing would occur in Calais due to its proximity to England. Rundstedt considered that sector as the most likely, although he did not rule out alternatives. After his inspections, Rommel saw in Normandy an evident vulnerability and considered it possible that the Allies would select that region. However, since there was no certainty, the distribution of forces ended up being a compromise solution, sectors heavily fortified and others with partial defences. The evaluations conducted by Rommel during the first months of 1944 highlighted the deficiencies of various units stationed on the coast. Many divisions were static, without motorized transport. Some lacked sufficient artillery or used pieces captured from different armies, which complicated the supply of ammunition. There were also units composed of personnel of various nationalities, recruited or reassigned from other fronts. Their cohesion and ability to withstand a massive attack were uncertain. Rommel tried to compensate for these limitations by reinforcing passive defense. He ordered the flooding of low areas behind the beaches, making it difficult for airborne troops to move. He also encouraged the installation of anti-tank obstacles, mines, and so-called wooden stakes intended to prevent glider landings. These measures increased defensive depth, but did not alter the fundamental problem, the absence of a common strategy. Rundstedt insisted on the need to maintain mobile reserves to be able to respond to an attack at any point. In his view, success depended on the ability to employ a critical mass of armoured units at the right moment. But that critical mass did not exist in 1944. The Reich's situation had deteriorated, and the availability of armoured units was limited. Of the divisions present on the Western Front, only a minority had real manoeuvrability, and many depended on equipment that had been used intensively on other fronts. The command structure increased the confusion. Rommel acted from the front, constantly inspecting the defences and requesting reinforcements. Rundstedt exercised broader command, trying to keep the regional operations cohesive. Hitler intervened directly, issuing specific orders from his headquarters in East Prussia. Alfred Jodl, at the OKW, tried to coordinate all these demands, but lacked authority to impose decisions that contradicted Hitler's wishes. The result was a system where orders overlapped, contradicted each other, or went unexecuted due to lack of clarity. In March of 1944, Hitler ordered the reinforcement of all coastal batteries and the construction of new bunkers. However, resources were already scarce. Concrete, steel, and labour had been intensively used during 1942 and 1943, and the Todt organization did not have the capacity to accelerate the construction pace. Allied bombings on German industrial centres further hindered production. Hitler's order could not be fulfilled within the established deadlines. The reports coming from France reflected this situation. Rommel warned that the defences were insufficient to stop a large-scale invasion. Rundstedt recommended reinforcing the armoured reserve, even knowing that he lacked the necessary control to use it immediately. Both agreed that the enemy was preparing, although they differed in the interpretation of how to defend the coast. Hitler received these reports, but his responses were ambiguous. He merely insisted that the Atlantic Wall should fulfill its function. By May of 1944, the command structure in the West had lost cohesion. The combination of divided reserves, incomplete fortifications, and units with disparate capabilities revealed a defensive system that could not act in an integrated manner. The doctrine had not been resolved, and the authority was fragmented. The German deployment depended on decisions that had to be made quickly, but that were distributed among commands with overlapping responsibilities. While these tensions occupied the German High Command, another dynamic was developing outside of their control. On the other side of the Channel, the Allies were analysing every structural weakness of the German defensive setup. They studied deployment patterns, the location of reserves, and the geographical characteristics of each sector. That analysis progressed even as the internal German discussion remained unresolved. At the beginning of 1944, while the German High Command remained entangled in a doctrinal debate that limited its capacity to articulate a coherent defence, the Allies advanced in a planned process with an unprecedented degree of detail. Preparation for a large-scale amphibious operation required precise information, sustained industrial capacity, and multinational coordination. The construction of this operational structure had begun 2 years earlier, but between January and May of 1944, it reached its decisive phase. In that period, every observable weakness in the Atlantic Wall was identified and turned into a foothold for the future operation, through a methodology that combined intensive reconnaissance, technical planning, and strategic deception. Aerial reconnaissance became the most important resource for creating a detailed picture of the German coastal defences. From the beginning of 1944, specialised British and American squadrons conducted daily flights over the sectors of the western coast. The aircraft used, mainly high-altitude Spitfires and long-range Mosquitoes, operated in flight profiles designed to maximise photographic quality and minimise exposure to enemy fire. Each mission produced series of images that were sent to photographic interpretation centres in England, where experienced analysts reviewed every detail. By May of that year, Allied files contained hundreds of thousands of photographs of Normandy, Brittany, Pas-de-Calais, and the Netherlands. These images were compared sequentially to detect changes in German positions, identify new constructions, or record unit movements. Analysts classified bunkers, artillery batteries, minefields, depots, and communication networks. Although the interpretation of these data was not always perfect, the whole allowed for a degree of knowledge difficult to obtain by other means. Thanks to this process, Allied planners had an almost continuous representation of the German defensive layout, with enough resolution to assess the density of fortifications in each sector. The intelligence obtained from the ground complemented this work. The French resistance, spread across numerous coastal regions, provided information on troop movements, patrol schedules, location of local headquarters, and the condition of the infrastructures. In many cases, inhabitants of rural areas sent coded reports through clandestine networks or via radio operators, trained and deployed specifically for that mission. This data allowed for validation or adjustment of the conclusions drawn from aerial reconnaissance and offered context on the daily activity of the German units. One of the most specific intelligence actions consisted of obtaining sand samples on the Normandy beaches. The planners needed to verify the beach's ability to support heavy vehicles. Teams of British commandos conducted night raids to collect samples in metal tubes, which were later analysed by specialists to determine their granulometry, stability, and composition. The results indicated that the conditions were suitable for the planned operations, which made it possible to proceed confidently with the final selection of beaches. With these elements, the Allied command developed a structured analysis of the strengths and weaknesses of the Atlantic Wall. It was identified, among other points, that the concentration of fortifications around Calais reflected German strategic priorities, based on the shorter distance with respect to England. This pattern left sectors of Normandy with comparatively lighter defences. It also became clear that the dispersion of the German armoured reserves, as well as their centralised control, would hinder a quick and coordinated response to a massive landing. Furthermore, it was observed that many coastal batteries lacked modern radar equipment to direct precise fire against moving targets. With these vulnerabilities defined, the Allies developed specific technical solutions. One of the most characteristic was the creation of special vehicles designed to overcome the defences built by Germany. Supervised by the British General Percy Hobart, these vehicles included modified versions of tanks intended to perform very specific tasks. Among them stood out the DD amphibious tanks, equipped with a floating structure to navigate to the beach, the crab tanks, which used rotating chains to detonate mines, the AVRE, designed to destroy fortifications with high explosive projectiles, and the Crocodile, which carried flamethrowers to neutralize fortified positions at close range. Each of these models was tested repeatedly in facilities that replicated the obstacles found on the French coast. Logistical obstacles also required innovative solutions. The experience of Dieppe had demonstrated the risk of attempting to capture a defended port. To avoid that situation, the Allies devised the Mulberry artificial harbours. These structures consisted of large concrete caissons, floating docks, and articulated elements that, once positioned, would allow vehicles and heavy equipment to be unloaded directly from the transports. The components were manufactured separately in different British ports and would be towed across the Channel once the operation began. In parallel, the Pluto project, an underwater pipeline, was prepared to ensure the continuous supply of fuel from England to the forces that would operate in France. The strategic component of deception was equally fundamental. Operation Bodyguard established a misinformation structure that aimed to convince Germany that the landing would take place in Calais. Its core, Operation Fortitude, combined false information transmitted by double agents, fake radio traffic, and the creation of a fictitious army, the First United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by General Patton. Although it did not exist as a real force, it was given a presence through inflatable tanks, wooden planes, simulated installations, and a considerable volume of fictitious communications. All of this reinforced the German impression that the main point of the invasion was opposite Calais. The bombing patterns were also adjusted to the deception. In the months leading up to the landing, the regions around Calais received a greater volume of air attacks than the areas in Normandy. The intensity of these bombings suggested direct offensive preparations, fueling the German perception that the main operation would be concentrated there. The combination of false signals and actual aerial activity strengthened the overall effect of the deception maneuver. At the same time, the Allies were executing a campaign to disrupt German mobility within France. The so-called transportation plan focused on destroying the railway infrastructure through precise attacks on stations, depots, and bridges. Between March and May of 1944, numerous logistical centers were neutralized. This campaign forced the German units to rely on road convoys, much more vulnerable to Allied aviation. In parallel, the French resistance intensified sabotage actions, destroying railway sections, cutting telephone lines, and hindering supply movements. The combination of aerial bombing and clandestine operations significantly reduced the German capacity to quickly move forces. The Allied preparation also included the use of airborne forces to secure key positions inland. The American airborne divisions would be dropped behind the Utah beaches to protect strategic roads and bridges, while British units would have the mission to secure critical crossing points over the waterways on the eastern flank of the selected area. The main role of these forces was to prevent or delay the arrival of German counterattacks. All these components were integrated through extensive exercises. Large-scale landing trials were conducted on the south coast of England, accurately replicating the conditions expected in the actual operation. Naval communications, the deployment of landing craft, coordination with supporting artillery, and the initial movement of troops were practiced repeatedly. Although some exercises suffered serious incidents, the information obtained allowed for immediate adjustments to procedures. Coordination between naval, air, and land forces was perfected during these months. The Navy assigned battleships, cruisers, and destroyers to specific sectors of the French coast, with defined objectives and precise sequences of prior bombardment. The Allied Air Force established patrol routes, attack profiles, and signaling systems designed to avoid incidents with their own troops and maximize the suppression of German defenses. By the end of May of 1944, the accumulated force in England had reached unprecedented figures. Millions of tons of material were distributed in depots, ports, and training fields. Thousands of ships and planes were assigned to specific tasks within the overall plan. The divisions destined for the landing had received detailed maps, specific orders, and training tailored to the sectors they were to occupy. This entire apparatus had been built with the goal of ensuring that, at the moment the operation began, each unit knew exactly what its role was. On the 5th of June, after a final evaluation of the weather conditions, the decision was made to execute the operation. The initial movements began that same night, with the concentration of convoys and the deployment of the first formations to their starting points. Although the outcome of the operation would depend on multiple factors, the Allied preparation had reached the level of detail necessary to face the German defenses with exhaustive planning and precise technical solutions. In this way, while the German fortifications remained in their positions and the units assigned to their defense continued their usual routine, the invasion force moved towards the coast with a planning structure designed to neutralize every obstacle identified during the previous months. During the previous months, the Allied device had been structured to exploit every visible weakness in the German defensive system. In the early morning of the 6th of June, 1944, that preparation converged into a single coordinated effort on multiple fronts. The Atlantic Wall remained active, with its bunkers occupied and its batteries prepared, but its capacity to function as an integrated system was about to be tested under extremely demanding operational conditions. At 12:15 a.m., the first component of the assault was deployed over the Norman interior. The Allied airborne forces were deployed to secure key points that would allow the advance from the beaches. The 82nd and 101st United States Airborne Divisions were dropped to the west of Utah Beach with the task of controlling crossroads, in bridges, and access roads that the Germans could use to counterattack. On the eastern flank, the 6th British Airborne Division was sent to occupy the bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River. The nighttime drop led to significant dispersion due to wind, lack of visibility, and anti-aircraft fire. Many units landed far from their assigned zones, forcing them to reorganize on the ground. Despite these difficulties, several key objectives were secured in the first few hours, providing control points that the Germans could not quickly recover. During the early phases of the assault, German information was limited and fragmentary. The garrisons reported airborne activity, but the initial interpretation was that it involved local commando operations. Telephone lines interrupted by previous bombings and sabotage prevented the swift transmission of reports. The lack of a clear picture delayed decision-making at higher levels of the German command, which contributed to a late reaction when reports began to arrive from different sectors. At 5:50 in the morning, when it was just beginning to dawn, the Allied naval artillery initiated a saturation bombardment. Large tonnage ships, including United States battleships and British cruisers, fired on coastal batteries, bunkers, and visible defensive positions. This bombardment had varying results. In some sectors, the accuracy and volume of fire neutralized the most exposed positions. In others, the fortifications built in reinforced concrete resisted direct impacts and remained operational. The Longues-sur-Mer battery, protected by solid bunkers, kept firing for hours before finally being silenced. Minutes before the landing, Allied heavy bombers attacked the inner coastal strip in order to weaken defensive positions near the beach. However, a large portion of those bombs fell too far from the shoreline due to the fear of hitting their own first waves. As a result, many bunkers, obstacles, and barbed wire remained practically intact when the amphibious phase began. At 06:30, the first landing craft reached the beaches. The variability in the German defensive performance became evident immediately. The functioning of the Atlantic Wall was not uniform. It depended on factors such as the quality of the troops, the density of fortifications, and the ability of each unit to maintain control under naval and air fire. At Utah Beach, the deviation caused by the current led the American units to land approximately 2 kilometers south of their intended point. That area had less dense defenses, with isolated bunkers and less coordinated machine gun positions. The garrison mostly belonged to the 709th Division, composed in part of older troops and eastern battalions. The amphibious tanks accompanying the first wave managed to arrive in sufficient number to provide immediate support. The German defenses resisted in isolated points, but failed to generate continuous or organized fire over the whole beach. By noon, the Americans had secured the main exits and established links with airborne elements. The advance inland progressed steadily, and American casualties were moderate in relation to the objectives achieved. The Omaha sector showed a completely different scenario. There, a series of factors coincided that favored the German defenders. The beach was bordered by cliffs that offered vantage observation points and shooting fields. The fortifications had been reinforced, and the garrison included elements of the 352nd Infantry Division, a unit with greater training and cohesion than the static troops deployed in other areas. The DD tanks launched at a greater distance were unable to approach due to the surf. Most sank before reaching the shore. The lack of armor left the infantry exposed. The bunkers covering Omaha were used effectively. The MG-42 machine guns operated with sustained cadence from protected positions, and the 75mm anti-tank guns directed precise fire at any attempt to move. In the initial moments, the landing craft were hit even before opening their ramps, and the units that managed to reach the sand were concentrated in narrow areas with no immediate possibility of maneuver. The interval between the tide line and the seawall forced the troops to cross a space under direct observation from multiple angles. The progression was only possible through movements on the flanks, where scattered groups took advantage of terrain depressions and less guarded routes to ascend via lateral accesses. The intervention of Allied destroyers, which approached the beach to fire directly at the German positions, allowed the reduction of defensive capability in key sectors. The advance was slow and costly, but by the afternoon there were sufficient penetrations in the German line to allow the development of a bridgehead. In Gold Beach, the British forces faced considerable defences, but achieved sustained advances thanks to the systematic use of specialised vehicles. The Longues-sur-Mer battery maintained fire for a good part of the morning, but was finally neutralised by naval artillery and ground fire. The crab tanks cleared routes through the minefields, while the AVRE blew up walls and obstacles. The German resistance was varied. Some positions fought until their ammunition was exhausted, others were abandoned in the face of the British advance. By the early hours of the afternoon, the advance had progressed several kilometres inland. The 3rd Canadian Division landed on Juno under complicated conditions. The high tide covered underwater obstacles, which caused damage to numerous vessels. The German defences held firm at entry points like Courseulles-sur-Mer. However, the Canadian offensive pace allowed them to overcome the defensive positions through a combination of support fire, specialised vehicles, and coordinated attacks against the bunkers. The inland penetration was one of the deepest of the day, although the casualties were significant. Sword Beach, at the easternmost end, was the scene of an initial rapid advance by the 3rd British Division. Coordination with airborne forces and the use of specialised armour facilitated overcoming the immediate defences. However, elements of the 21st Panzer Division launched a counterattack toward noon, advancing toward the coast. Although the attack managed to approach areas near the sea, British anti-tank fire and naval support neutralised the threat and caused the German retreat. This counterattack, although limited, delayed the British advance towards Caen. During this day, several coastal batteries showed diverse performance. Some were neutralised early through airborne actions or precise bombings. Others resisted for hours, like the Crispec battery, which maintained its combat capability beyond the first day. The battery located at Pointe du Hoc, the target of a specific operation led by American soldiers who climbed cliffs under fire, was partially dismantled at the time of the assault, which reduced its impact in the initial phase of the invasion. However, the main limitation of the German defence was not in the individual strength of its bunkers, but in the inability to coordinate a timely response. The armoured reserves that could have influenced the situation were distributed in different sectors, and their movement depended on authorizations that did not arrive with the necessary speed. The command structure, divided between Rommel, Rundstedt, and the OKW, complicated decision-making. Added to this was the Allied air activity, which dominated the airspace and prevented the concentration of forces or the continuous movement of armoured columns. Throughout the afternoon, as the bridgeheads expanded and the immediate defences were overcome, it became clear that the Atlantic Wall had not succeeded in fulfilling its role as a barrier capable of containing an invasion during the critical hours. In some sectors, the fortifications offered prolonged resistance. In others, they were flanked or isolated. The Allied mobility, supported by a considerable naval and air deployment, allowed the consolidation of positions along the entire landing zone. By midnight on the 6th of June, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers were on French territory. The 5 beaches maintained stable bridgeheads, although not yet united with each other. The German ability to mount a coordinated counterattack had been significantly reduced. Units that began to move toward Normandy did so under constant air threat, with continuous losses and accumulated delays. The Atlantic Wall had demonstrated the strength of some of its positions, but it also exposed its structural deficiencies: uneven distribution of fortifications, lack of immediate reserves, lack of mobility under enemy air control, variable quality of garrisons, and a fragmented command structure. What would continue in the following days would no longer be a struggle for the coast, but a broader confrontation in the Norman interior, where the troop density, control of the accesses, and the German ability to reorganize their lines would be decisive for the outcome of the campaign. The night of June 6, 1944, left the Allies in control of 5 bridgeheads in Normandy, The Atlantic Wall had been breached at several points, and although the German positions were still offering resistance, the possibility of repelling the invasion during the first hours, the essential condition of the German doctrine, had been lost. From the dawn of June 7th, the war in the West ceased to be a confrontation between coastal fortifications and amphibious forces, transforming into a prolonged land battle in which the quality of the reserves, air power, and logistics would be decisive. The first days were critical. The beachheads needed to expand and, above all, connect. The British forces that had landed on Gold and Juno joined on June 7th, creating a continuous front. In the American sector, the 101st Airborne Division was fighting for control of Carentan, a vital crossroads between Utah and Omaha. After intense fighting around the hedgerows of the Bocage, Carentan fell on June 12th, finally linking the American sectors and eliminating the possibility of the Germans fracturing the Western Front. With the bridgeheads now connected, attention focused on Caen, the city whose capture had been planned for D-Day, but which became a German defensive linchpin. Caen was the point where essential roads and railways converged. Surrendering it meant allowing the Allies to maneuver on open ground beyond the Bocage. The Germans knew this and concentrated their best units there. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, composed largely of young soldiers with veteran officers, arrived at the front in the days following the landing and established a solid defensive line. The 21st Panzer Division reinforced the sector from the start. On June 13th, the British attempted to encircle Caen through Operation Perch. The advance was stopped at Villers-Bocage after an ambush by German tanks led by Commander Michael Wittmann, whose Tiger I destroyed multiple British vehicles in a matter of minutes. Although the action did not alter the strategic situation, it delayed the British advance and allowed the Germans to consolidate new defences. While Caen absorbed most of the attention of the German command, the Americans advanced towards the Cotentin Peninsula with the aim of taking Cherbourg. The port was indispensable. The Mulberry artificial harbours, although functional, could not indefinitely sustain the volume of supplies required by an expanding army. As the American units moved north, they encountered fragmented but tenacious resistance. The Bocage favoured the defence. The tall hedges with embankments of hardened earth turned each field into a natural fortified position. However, the German situation was rapidly deteriorating due to the lack of mobile reserves, ammunition, and reinforcements. On June 18th, the United States forces reached the western coast of the peninsula, isolating Cherbourg. The German garrison, some 40,000 men under the command of General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, attempted to fulfill Hitler's order to turn the city into a fortress. However, the Allied encirclement, accompanied by systematic aerial and artillery bombardments, reduced the German defensive capability. After several days of urban fighting, the city fell on June 26th. The port facilities had been destroyed by the Germans before surrendering, which delayed their use by the Allies, but the capture of the enclave represented a decisive material and psychological setback for the Reich forces in the west. Meanwhile, the British resumed their offensives against Caen. Operation Epsom, launched on the 25th of June, sought to encircle it from the west with a massive advance involving more than 60,000 soldiers. They advanced several kilometers, but counterattacks from newly arrived panzer divisions halted the momentum. The Das Reich and Hohenstaufen divisions of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps moved from the east, struck the British flanks. Epsom ended with the stabilization of a salient, but it did not achieve its main objective. Caen remained in German hands, protected by worn-out but still effective armoured units. The cost for Germany was enormous. The panzer divisions, designed for mobility, were being forced to fight defensively in urban areas and enclosed terrain. The Luftwaffe could barely intervene. The Allies completely controlled the sky. Every German movement during the day exposed entire units to fighter bombers. Hitler's insistence on holding fixed positions prevented tactical withdrawals to better defended lines. The German commanders, including Rommel and Rundstedt, insisted on the need to give up ground, but their recommendations were rejected. On the 1st of July, Rundstedt was dismissed. His replacement, Günther von Kluge, arrived with orders to stabilize the front and prepare a counterattack, but he soon concluded that conditions did not allow it. On the 17th of July, Rommel was seriously wounded when his car was attacked by an Allied plane, leaving him out of action. 3 days later, the July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler occurred. Although Rommel did not participate directly, he was implicated. In October, he would be forced to commit suicide. The episode triggered a massive purge that further destabilized the German command just when it needed coordination and flexibility. On the 8th of July, after weeks of offensives and bombardments, the British captured the northern part of Caen. The city was devastated. The remaining areas continued in German hands until mid-month. When it finally fell in its entirety, its strategic value had diminished, as the Americans were already advancing into the interior of France by alternative routes. By the end of July, the Allies had concentrated in Normandy more than 1 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and a flow of supplies that exceeded any German interdiction capacity. The German divisions, in contrast, were exhausted. The losses of tanks and personnel had been irreplaceable. The panzer units were operating with a fraction of their original allotment. Fuel was scarce, and the supply lines were collapsed. On July 25th, the 1st United States Army launched Operation Cobra, aimed at breaking the German front in the western sector. The attack began with a massive aerial bombardment. More than 2,000 Allied bombers saturated the German defenses. The simultaneous explosion of thousands of bombs completely disorganized the German line. Communications were destroyed, commanders isolated, and units displaced. Although some German elements resisted, the collapse of the front in that sector was inevitable. The infantry and armored divisions of the United States penetrated deeply into the German lines. General Omar Bradley ordered an immediate exploitation, and the divisions advanced towards Avranches, a key point to open the way towards Brittany and southern France. On the 30th of July, Avranches fell. Bradley and the newly activated Third Army of General George Patton launched a series of simultaneous advances along roads, towns, and secondary routes, overwhelming the German capacity to form a new line of defense. Hitler, refusing to accept the seriousness of the situation, ordered an immediate counterattack. Operation Lüttich began on the 7th of August with the objective of recapturing Avranches and cutting off the American advance. The attack involved what remained of several panzer divisions, but the plan was detected by Allied intelligence. Allied fighter bombers, operating with absolute dominion, attacked the German armored columns. The advancing units did so without air cover, with limited fuel, and under fragmented command. In less than 2 days, Lüttich failed. The German losses were so high that the possibility of organizing another offensive in Normandy was ruled out. The defeat left the Germans exposed in a salient that the Allies sought to close from the north and the south. Operation Totalize, launched by the Canadians on the 8th of August, advanced towards Falaise. The intention was to close a pincer with the American forces advancing from the west. German resistance was fierce. Very worn-out units like the 12th SS Hitlerjugend or the 2nd Panzer fought with determination, trying to keep a corridor open to the east to allow the withdrawal of the bulk of the forces trapped in Normandy. The closing of the pocket advanced slowly. The Germans maintained some cohesion and, above all, were compelled to fight for their survival. There were no reserves available. Each remaining unit had to delay the enemy long enough for others to escape. Even so, the encirclement was tightening. On the 19th of August, the Canadian, Polish, and American forces finally closed the pocket around Falaise, Troun, and Chambois. The concentration of trapped forces was enormous. The Allied bombings and strafings during the reduction of the pocket left the area covered with remnants of vehicles, artillery, and corpses. The destruction of Army Group B in Normandy was almost total. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers died in the encirclement, and about 50,000 were captured. Tens of thousands managed to escape before the final closure, but without heavy equipment, without cohesion, and without the ability to form new defensive lines. On the 25th of August, Paris was liberated. In the following weeks, the Allied advance reached Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of the German border. The organized defense of Western France had ceased to exist. By mid-September, there was no operational trace of the Atlantic Wall. The fortifications remained standing on the coast, but their purpose had vanished. Each defended sector had been overcome by maneuver, aerial fire, or attrition. The garrisons had been captured, destroyed, or abandoned. What was once conceived as a continuous barrier now appeared as a scattered collection of powerless structures in the face of modern warfare. Between June and August of 1944, the destruction of the German defensive system in the West was total. The combination of doctrinal errors, political interference, insufficient resources, and delays in decision-making prevented any coherent defense after D-Day. Once the coastal fortifications were overcome, the Wehrmacht could not sustain prolonged defensive operations against an adversary that dominated the air, the sea, and logistics. The Atlantic Wall not only failed as a physical structure, it failed as a strategic concept. Its destruction in Normandy revealed the limitations of relying on static fortifications in the age of combined warfare. Its fall marked the beginning of the end of the German occupation in Western Europe and made it clear that even the most monumental defenses are worthless when separated from a coherent strategy, unified command, and maneuverability that responds to the realities of modern warfare.